1324, a man left his kingdom to go on a religious pilgrimage. He brought with him 60,000 people. 12,000 of them were personal servants, each one dressed in silk. He brought 100 camels, each one carrying 300 pounds of gold. When he passed through Cairo, he gave away so much gold to the poor, to scholars, to anyone who asked, that he single-handedly collapsed the value of gold across Egypt for the next 12 years. The economy of an entire empire. Destabilized by one man's pocket change. His name was Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali, and according to most historians and economists who have attempted to calculate it, he was the richest human being who has ever lived. Richer than Jeff Bezos, richer than Elon Musk, richer by some calculations than all of them combined, and almost nobody outside of West Africa has ever heard his name. This is the story of the empire he built, the pilgrimage that broke an economy, and the deliberate, centuries-long erasure of one of the greatest civilizations in human history. To understand Mansa Musa, you have to understand the empire he was born into, the Mali Empire. By the 14th century, one of the largest empires on the face of the earth, stretching across West Africa for over 2,000 miles, from the Atlantic coast to the edges of the Sahara, encompassing territory that today includes parts of Senegal, Guinea, Mali, Niger, and beyond. This was not a minor regional kingdom. This was one of the 4 largest empires in the world at the time it existed, comparable in scale to the Mongol Empire, to Yuan Dynasty China, to anything Europe had produced. And it was built on something specific, something the rest of the medieval world desperately needed and could not produce themselves: gold. Mali sat at the center of the most productive gold-producing region on Earth. The Bambouk and Bure goldfields, located within Mali's sphere of influence, produced an estimated 2/3 of the world's gold supply during this period. 2/3 of the entire world's gold coming from this one region, controlled by this one empire. And alongside the gold, salt. In a world without refrigeration, salt was not a seasoning. It was a preservation technology essential to survival, worth, in some trade contexts, literally its weight in gold. Mali controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes that connected the gold-producing south to the salt-producing Sahara and the merchant cities of North Africa beyond. Every camel caravan that moved gold north, every camel caravan that moved salt south, passed through Mali and paid for the privilege. This was the empire Mansa Musa inherited in 1312, not a kingdom on the periphery of history, the literal economic engine of the medieval world. The way Mansa Musa became emperor is itself one of history's most extraordinary and least told stories. His predecessor, Mansa Abu Bakr II, was, according to the primary historical source for this period, the Arab historian al-Makrizi, a ruler consumed by a singular, audacious obsession: the Atlantic Ocean. Abu Bakr II had become convinced that the limits of the ocean could be explored and possibly crossed. And so he did something almost no other ruler in recorded history has done. He organized an expedition. Not a small one. The first expedition reportedly consisted of 200 ships, filled with men, equipped to sail west into the Atlantic and report back what they found. Only one ship returned. Its captain reported that the rest had been swallowed by a powerful current in the middle of the ocean, likely the same Canary Current that modern oceanographers recognize as a genuine hazard to medieval ocean-going vessels. Most rulers would have stopped there. Abu Bakr II did not stop there. He organized a second expedition, this one of 2,000 ships, carrying men, supplies, enough provisions for years. And this time, he did not send them. He went himself. He appointed Musa, his deputy, to govern the empire in his absence, and he sailed west into the Atlantic Ocean. And he never returned. Mansa Musa became emperor of Mali not through conquest, not through inheritance in the traditional sense, but because the previous emperor sailed into the Atlantic Ocean, searching for its edge, and was never heard from again. Some historians dispute the details of this account, but what is not disputed is this. In 1312, Mansa Musa became the ruler of one of the wealthiest empires on earth, and he intended to use that wealth in a way the world had never seen. Under Mansa Musa's rule, the Mali Empire reached the absolute height of its power, wealth, and influence. He expanded the empire's territory significantly, conquering 24 cities along the Niger River, including the legendary trading city of Timbuktu. Timbuktu, a name that has become, in the centuries since, a kind of Western shorthand for an impossibly distant, almost mythical place. But Timbuktu was real, and under Mansa Musa, it became one of the great intellectual and commercial centers of the medieval world. He commissioned the construction of mosques, libraries, and universities throughout his empire. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu, built during this period, became one of the great centers of learning in the Islamic world, eventually housing a library estimated to contain between 400,000 and 700,000 manuscripts. Scholars traveled from Cairo, from Mecca, from across the Islamic world to study in Timbuktu, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, Islamic law, history. At a time when much of Europe remained largely illiterate outside of religious institutions, Timbuktu was producing scholars and manuscripts on a scale that rivaled the great intellectual centers of Cairo and Baghdad. Musa centralized the administration of his vast territory, appointing governors, establishing a standardized system of trade regulation, building an infrastructure of roads and way stations that allowed the gold and salt trade to move with a level of organization and security that made Mali's trade routes the safest and most reliable in the medieval world. Under his rule, Mali was not simply wealthy, it was organized, sophisticated, stable, a genuine, functioning, world-class civilization. And then, in 1324, Mansa Musa decided to go on Hajj. Every Muslim who is able is required, at least once in their lifetime, to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim, and he was also, by 1324, perhaps the wealthiest human being on the face of the earth. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary displays of wealth in recorded human history. The exact numbers vary slightly between historical sources, but the scale they describe is consistent and staggering. He departed Mali with a procession of approximately 60,000 people, soldiers, officials, scholars, merchants, and 12,000 personal servants, each one, according to the Arab historian al-Makrizi, dressed in fine Persian silk. He brought 100 camels, each one loaded with approximately 300 pounds of gold. That is not a typo. 300 pounds per camel, 100 camels. The mathematics of this alone place the gold he carried at a scale that modern economists have struggled to even meaningfully convert into present-day value. He also brought, by some accounts, his senior wife and several hundred more attendants dedicated solely to her retinue. The procession was organized with the precision of a moving city, because in every meaningful sense, that is what it was. The journey took him across the Sahara, through the great trading cities of West Africa, and eventually north toward Cairo, the gateway to Mecca. And it was in Cairo that the event occurred that historians still discuss today. Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo and began, with the specific generosity of a man who has never had to consider the concept of running out of money, giving away gold. To the poor, to scholars, to mosque officials, to anyone, by some accounts, who simply asked him. He gave so much gold so quickly to so many people that the basic economic principle of supply and demand did exactly what it does in every economy, in every century, when a commodity's available supply suddenly and dramatically increases. The value of gold collapsed. Historical and modern economic analyses estimate that Mansa Musa's gold distribution in Cairo caused inflation that devalued gold across Egypt and the surrounding region for approximately a decade. Some estimates extend the recovery period even longer. An entire regional economy destabilized, not through war, not through conquest, through generosity so extreme that it broke the basic mathematics of currency. The Arab historian al-Makrizi, writing decades later, recorded that the people of Cairo still spoke of Mansa Musa's visit as one of the most extraordinary events in the city's memory. Gold, he wrote, remained at a lower value in Cairo for years afterward because of the sheer quantity that one man had brought into circulation in a matter of weeks. On his return journey, having spent and given away so much gold that his own funds reportedly ran short, Mansa Musa is recorded to have borrowed money from merchants in Cairo at extremely high interest rates simply to be able to afford the journey home. The richest man in the world, borrowing money because he had given away too much of his own. The pilgrimage did something beyond reshaping Egyptian gold markets. It put Mali on the map. Literally. Word of Mansa Musa's extraordinary wealth spread across the Mediterranean world and into Europe through merchant networks, travelers' accounts, and the diplomatic correspondence of the period. By 1339, just 15 years after the pilgrimage, Mali appeared by name on European maps for the first time. And in 1375, the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important and influential maps of the medieval period, created in Majorca for the King of France, depicted Mansa Musa himself, seated on a golden throne, holding a golden orb in one hand and a golden scepter in the other, wearing a golden crown. This image, created by European cartographers who had never seen him, working entirely from second-hand accounts of his wealth, became one of the most widely circulated and influential depictions of Africa in medieval European cartography. For the better part of a century, European maps used the image of Mansa Musa, golden, enthroned, holding the literal symbols of wealth in both hands, as the visual representation of West Africa itself. A region of the world that most Europeans had never visited and knew almost nothing about, was, for an entire era, represented on the maps of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe by the image of one black African emperor, sitting on a throne of gold. If Mansa Musa was genuinely the richest human being who has ever lived, if his wealth was significant enough to be recorded by Arab historians, mapped by European cartographers, and remembered in Cairo for a decade after his visit, why does almost nobody outside of West Africa know his name? The answer is not simple, but it is not a mystery either. Part of the answer lies in the specific, deliberate historical erasure that affected the broader history of pre-colonial Africa. For centuries, European historical scholarship operated on the assumption, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicitly stated, that sub-Saharan Africa had no significant pre-colonial history worth serious study. Empires like Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, and others were minimized, dismissed, or simply omitted from the historical narratives that Western education systems built and taught for generations. This was not an accident of incomplete information. The information existed. Arab historians like al-Makrizi, Ibn Khaldun, and Ibn Battuta, who personally visited Mali during this period and left detailed first-hand accounts of its wealth, its organization, and its sophistication, wrote extensively about West African civilization. Their accounts were available. They were largely ignored by the European historical tradition that came to dominate global education in the centuries that followed. Part of the answer also lies in simple historical timing. Mali's golden age occurred centuries before the period of European colonization of Africa that began in earnest in the 19th century. The colonial narrative that justified European conquest depended, in significant part, on the portrayal of Africa as a continent without significant civilizational history, a narrative that the genuine, well-documented history of empires like Mali directly contradicted. It was, in a very real sense, more useful to the colonial project to not know about Mansa Musa. And so, for the most part, the world did not, until recently. In recent decades, increased historical scholarship, the digitization of the Timbuktu manuscripts, and a broader reckoning with the gaps in global historical education have begun to bring Mansa Musa's story back into wider public awareness. But the fact that this correction is only happening now, 700 years after his pilgrimage, tells its own story about which histories get remembered and which histories get erased. Mansa Musa died around 1337. The exact circumstances of his death, like much of his life, are not fully documented in surviving historical records. What he left behind was an empire at the absolute height of its power, wealth, and intellectual influence. A civilization whose university in Timbuktu would continue producing scholars and manuscripts for centuries after his death. Many of those manuscripts survive today, hundreds of thousands of them, preserved by families in Timbuktu who protected them through wars, through colonization, through the specific danger of extremist groups who, in recent years, attempted to destroy them. Local archivists smuggled tens of thousands of these manuscripts out of Timbuktu in 2012 to protect them from destruction during a period of conflict, hiding them in trunks, in private homes, moving them by night to keep them safe. The same impulse that drove Mansa Musa to build libraries and universities 700 years ago, the belief that knowledge is worth protecting, worth preserving, worth carrying across impossible distances at impossible risk, is the same impulse that drove ordinary Malian citizens to risk their lives protecting his legacy in 2012. The gold is gone, the empire is gone, but the manuscripts remain. And so does the story. What do we do with Mansa Musa? He is, by most reasonable economic calculations, the wealthiest human being who has ever lived. Wealthier than any oil baron, any tech founder, any monarch of the modern era. And for most of the last 700 years, almost nobody outside of West Africa has known his name. That gap between the scale of what he achieved and the scale of what the world remembers is not an accident of history. It is a choice that was made, repeatedly, by the people who decided which stories got written into the textbooks and which stories got left out. Mansa Musa built an empire that controlled 2/3 of the world's gold supply. He built a city of scholarship that produced hundreds of thousands of manuscripts at a time when most of Europe could not read. He gave away so much wealth in a few weeks in Cairo that he altered the value of gold across an entire region for a decade. And when European mapmakers, decades later, tried to capture the idea of Africa on a single page, the image they reached for was him, golden, enthroned, holding the entire wealth of a continent in two outstretched hands. History tried to forget him. It did not entirely succeed. And the more of his story gets told, the harder it becomes to forget him again. If this video changed how you see African history, share it with someone who has never heard his name. Subscribe